I never used to believe in those horror stories you read on the internet. I always thought that, in the end, everything had a logical explanation. But what happened on that trip made me question a lot of things. This was about 2 years ago, and even today, when I think about it, I get chills all over again. My 3 friends and I hit the road for a spontaneous trip through the countryside. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway, no real destination, just driving and stopping wherever seemed interesting. But that night, we were exhausted, and when we saw that abandoned rest stop by the side of the highway, we decided to pull over for a bit. The place was weird, not just old and forgotten, but wrong. The kind of place that looks like it was abandoned in a hurry, like no one had time to shut everything down properly before leaving. The gas pumps were rusted, like they hadn't been used in decades. The restaurant had boarded up windows, but one of the glass doors was still there, covered in what looked like grime, or something else I didn't want to think about. The only accessible building was a bathroom, its lights flickering erratically. When we got out of the car, the silence around us wasn't normal. It wasn't the silence of an empty place. It was that heavy, suffocating quiet, like the whole environment was holding its breath. We went into the bathroom more out of curiosity than necessity. The smell was damp, like something long forgotten, but it wasn't as unbearable as you'd expect from a place abandoned for so long. The sinks were filthy, stained with rust, and the mirrors were so covered in dust they barely reflected anything. That's when the first weird thing happened. One of the stalls was closed, and while we were looking around, we heard the distinct sound of a latch unlocking. We froze instantly. The door creaked open slowly, like something out of a horror movie, but there was no one inside. We exchanged nervous glances and let out an awkward laugh, trying to rationalize it. Must have been the wind, someone muttered, but there was no wind at all. Even so, we left the bathroom, not wanting to stay there any longer than necessary. That's when Marcos, one of my friends, suddenly stopped and pointed toward the woods beside the rest stop. "There's someone there," he whispered. In the darkness of the trees, I swear I saw a figure, something, or someone, standing still, watching us. The worst part, it didn't move. It didn't step back, didn't hide. It just stood there, motionless. We stood frozen for a while, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It was one of those moments where your brain struggles to process because none of it makes sense. The figure was dark, hard to define, but it was definitely there, watching. Marcos grabbed his phone to shine a light in that direction, but the moment the beam hit the trees, there was nothing there. No sound of footsteps, no sign of movement, nothing. As if it had never existed. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a strange pressure in the air, like something was waiting for us to make the next move. That was when we decided it was time to leave. The unease was too strong, and even though no one wanted to admit it, we were scared. We hurried back to the car, barely speaking, just wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. The problem was, when Lucas, who was driving, turned the key, the car wouldn't start. He tried again. Nothing. No sound. Not even the engine attempting to turn over. Just the overwhelming silence around us. Panic started creeping in. The car had been working perfectly just minutes ago. It made no sense. Lucas kept trying while Marcos muttered curses under his breath. Meanwhile, I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw it again, standing at the edge of the road. Closer. My heart nearly stopped. I wanted to tell the others, but my throat locked up. It was still there, in the exact same posture, only much closer this time. I couldn't make out any features, no clothes, nothing. Just a dark silhouette, completely still, like it knew we were trapped. I forced my voice to come out and barely whispered, "There's someone behind us." Lucas stopped turning the key and looked in the mirror. The way he went pale told me he saw it too. Marcos turned around to look directly and muttered shaky, "Holy shit." No one moved. No one breathed. The only thing we knew was that whatever that thing was, it shouldn't be there. Then, out of nowhere, a loud thud hit the side of the car. A deep, solid impact, strong enough to make the metal vibrate. Lucas frantically turned the key again, and this time, the engine sputtered and roared to life. He floored the gas pedal without hesitation, speeding away as fast as possible. No one looked back. I didn't want to know if it was still standing there, or if it had moved. But when we were finally far enough to see the lights of a town on the horizon, Marcos broke the silence with something that made my blood run cold. "Did you guys hear more than one knock?" I was about to say no, that it was just one, but then I realized there had been two, one on each side of the car. The silence in the car was suffocating. No one wanted to be the first to say what that meant. Two knocks, one on each side, like there was more than one thing out there, surrounding us. My stomach twisted at the thought. Marcos let out a nervous chuckle, but it was forced shaky. "Whatever it was, it's gone now," he muttered, trying to convince himself more than us. But I wasn't so sure. My body was still tense, and that unsettling feeling hadn't left. The car sped down the empty road, but I couldn't shake the thought that we were still being watched. Then, the radio turned on by itself. A loud, static-filled noise that made everyone jump. Lucas frantically pressed buttons, trying to turn it off, change the station, anything. But nothing worked. The static just kept growing louder, almost swallowing the entire car. And then, in the middle of that unbearable noise, we heard something. Faint, buried within the static, but unmistakably a voice. We couldn't understand the words. It was like a distorted whisper, dragging, almost like it was trying to speak, but couldn't. That was enough for Lucas to yank the wires out in desperation, cutting the sound completely. The silence returned, but the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped lingered. No one said a word after that. The road felt endless, and I just wanted to see a sign telling us we were close to civilization. My heart only started to slow down when we finally spotted the entrance to a small town. Lucas drove straight to a gas station, parked hastily, and got out before even turning the engine off. We all did the same. We were shaking, sweating, like we had just run a marathon. We stood there under the station's bright lights, looking at each other, trying to process everything. That's when we noticed the worst part. The car was dirty, but it wasn't dust, not mud. There were marks, handprints, small ones, like a child's, all over the hood, the doors, the back window. Some were so clear you could see long fingers pressed against the metal. Lucas took a step back, shaking his head, whispering no, 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 like he was trying to rewrite reality. Marcos opened his mouth to say something, but stopped himself. We had no explanation. The knocks, the figure, the radio, and now this. The only thing we knew for sure was that whatever was at that abandoned rest stop didn't want us to leave. And somehow, it had touched the car before we escaped. No one dared to wipe the prints off. It felt like touching them would make everything worse. We stayed at the gas station for a while, barely talking, just trying to come to terms with what happened. The attendant glanced at us a few times, probably thinking we were just a bunch of exhausted college kids. But then, at one point he frowned, pointed at the car, and asked, "Where do you guys drive through?" His tone wasn't casual. It was serious, almost suspicious. Lucas hesitated, but eventually mentioned the abandoned rest stop. The attendant went quiet for a moment, then sighed heavily. "You guys were lucky." That's all he said before walking back inside the convenience store, not explaining anything. None of us had the guts to ask. We got back in the car, driving slowly, afraid that something was still following us. The rest of the trip felt off, like everything was back to normal, but also not. When we finally got home, we all went our separate ways, avoiding talking about it. But some nights, I still think about it. The figure, the radio, the handprints. And worst of all, the attendant said we were lucky. But he never explained lucky to escape what.